listening to Rally DNA. Hello and welcome back to Rally DNA. I'm Killian Cronin, and joining me as ever is my illustrious co-host Jamie Arkle. Hello, Jamie.
Hello, Killian. Hello, everyone.
This week marks our 10th episode, for which will be our last for season 1 of Rally DNA. And Tony Simpson, that's for you. I know you like a season. So let me start by saying thanks to very much to everyone who's been listening to the pod so far. It's great to watch the listenership grow and the support and comments we get online. It really drives us to keep going and make more of these. It's really been a lot of fun. I think we've both enjoyed it, Jamie, to be fair.
Absolutely, man.
And thank you also to all of our guests who kindly gave up their time to talk to two rally fans who are kind of just nerding out and indulging our passion for the sport.
Yeah, truly. I mean, the response from everyone has been absolutely top draw. I mean, completely out of all proportion, I think, than both of us expected, to be honest. Absolutely,
yeah. I mean, the engagement from people we've been reaching out to is fantastic, and ever so surprising still as it goes on. So yeah, hopefully that keeps it up, that it does stay that way. Please, if you want to be on the pod, do contact us. So this week for episode 10 and the season finale, we thought it was apt to do a slight twist on the top 10 type formula. And the twist is, in fact, that it is just a list of 10. We're not actually trying to rank these or grade them, because that would provide far too much controversy for us to handle, no doubt. So today, Jamie and I will be discussing 10 interesting / consequential career moves by drivers in the World Rally Championship over the years. These aren't necessarily good moves or ones that seem, a genius, that they were absolutely going to lead to success. In fact, some decidedly are not good moves, but we of course have the benefit of hindsight. And rallying, of course, as we know, it doesn't always present so many options to its competitors. There isn't a lot of cars, seats, or teams, even at its peak in terms of manufacturers backing cars. There isn't a lot of choice out there for a guy looking to get a contract and a seat that's going to steady him for a few years. So 10 moves that are memorable and worthy of discussion might be more appropriate, but that wouldn't be the easiest title for Spotify, would it?
I think it's also worth noting that it's sort of consequential for either the driver or occasionally the championship as a whole, because some did completely alter the way a given season panned out, whereas some on a more micro level just completely torpedoed a given driver's season.
Absolutely, yeah. And some are even examples, maybe. I think one we'll point out certainly seems to be almost a passing of a torch moment in the end of one era of regulations into another, where some people maybe don't quite make the jump and make it work from one set of regs to the other.
Absolutely.
So, Jamie, do you want to lead us away with number 10? Well, it's not number 10, but we're going to do maybe chronologically here. So we'll start with this one.
That's it. We start with way back in 1977 with Walter Roll from his jumping ship midway through the 77 season from Opel to Fiat. It's always fascinated me, this one, as much as obviously Walter Roll's formative career was completely Opel based, various Asconas and cadets and things and CIH engines for days. And then he found himself seemingly sitting very pretty indeed with the Cadet GTE in 1975, and it's one of these rally cars that on paper appears to have all the makings of a world beater, available in 8-valve engines to start with, and then 16-valve version soon after, but it turned into an absolute nightmare for the team. Maddeningly poor reliability, and largely with transmission and engine related issues.
And of course, what's probably as much interesting as anything with this one is that it's a mid-season jump, which you just don't really see in any motorsport. There's examples throughout the years, but it's normally pretty clear cut. Season and contract ends, or one looks to start a season with somewhere else. But to jump mid-season surely gives an indication into his mindset at the time and his frustrations with that, issue plagued 16-valve engine.
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, it's definitely worth mentioning that I guess teams and the structure of the championship was far less codified back then. So it wasn't unknown for, you didn't have to compete in every rally as a manufacturer. And look at what Roll and the rest were doing. with Mercedes and Toyota and anyone else in the early 80s. You know, that anyone who any seat going potentially. But you're right, and I mean, to give him his credit, I think Walter stuck at that GTE for a very long time indeed, probably because he got the sense that the car itself was fundamentally decent. I mean, God, Christ, look at it. It's a great looking car. It has to be good, right? And, you know, a proper peak Group 4 thing. But, you know, the 16-valve engine was introduced, homologated in 1976, and was plenty powerful, but just sort of seemed to tip the transmission over the edge in terms of what it could cope with, and just constant litany of retirements, head gasket failures, oil surge issues and the like, throughout 76 and 1977. And I mean, it's well documented that the Group 1 cars all had 8-valve heads, and they did invariably better in terms of top 10 finishes. You know, fellas like Anders Cooling doing, you know, netting decent top 10 scores throughout this period. And the 16-valve, I mean, Walter won, I think it was EPA at the 16-valve, but most of the time it ended by the side of the road with a pool of water and a big cloud of steam.
So it should be pointed out as well that those issues that you've listed there aren't particularly unique for the period either. They were something that would crop up in almost any car. Transmissions were generally weaker then. Head gaskets were an issue that would play a part for a good while after that in rallying. But it must just show maybe just that he was so happy with the previous car. And even you'd assume a driver of his competency, mechanical sympathy is far more important than others, or than more recent times, that it must have just been fairly fragile.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you'd assume that a driver who maybe not owes his career to Opel, but certainly owes a degree of progression up to that point, he'd want to make it with the team that had given him that chance. And, you know, he stuck with it for a long time, but then the opportunity to drive a Fiat 131 arose in the September of 1977, and he elected it. And you know, it's hard to fault that decision, because a couple of years later, he won his first world title, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, look, and another peak Group 4 car as well, that 131 is hard to say no to, I'd imagine, at the time.
Pisses all over an Escort.
I thought we were avoiding controversy. Although you've got to say, on the subject of cadets, we just don't see enough of those in around this, certainly around my parts anyway.
What's weird about it is it seems to have had an outside impact on sort of rallying culture for a car that did very little in terms of, you know, quantifiable results. We all know that what a Cadet GT looks like, that you know, fantastic wasp-like livery, the ATS 5 spokes. You know, it's kind of it's got a real sort of cultural pull to it, or perhaps that's just me speaking for us rally nerds. But you know, seems to be its cultural clout seems to outweigh its achievement.
Perhaps, and maybe more so for us. I guess maybe more people might say associate an Opel rally car with an Ascona or a Manta, perhaps in a more publicized, documented era. That probably more videos and footage exists of those cars.
We are way down the esoteric rabbit warren, and delightfully so.
Absolutely. Well, with that, let's maybe move on to the next one on our list. And sticking with the transitional era, we're just coming from Group 4 to the guy who maybe is best known for that transition, Hannu Mikkola, for going from his decision to go from Ford or Mercedes, whatever way you want to look at it, as he was driving Mercedes cars as well in that era, to go to the Group B. Well, it'd still be the Group 4 Audi Quattro at that point. 4-wheel drive, you know, this was just an unknown in rallying, and it is a sliding doors moment for the sport, and for him. You know, no one could have foreseen the impact that car had. In fact, I'd wager that people really thought that it wouldn't have that impact, if anything. And yeah, I mean, you know, we will talk about it more, but it's easy to skip to the end here and say the rest is history. Mikkola in a Quattro, they go hand in hand, you know, just dominated on loose surface. And yeah, I mean, he's the guy I still associate with a Quattro the most. Personally speaking, although, you know, it's easy to picture Mouton and Blomqvist driving later models, but I think for me, Mikola and Quattro are the defining pairing for that car.
It's weird, isn't it? It's definitely up there. Although for me, Mikola is his Escort rather. But absolutely, I think it's complete. It's almost impossible for anyone born after the event and not watching it at the time to sort of grasp how much of a stab in the dark it was. You know, Audi obviously didn't have any rallying presence to speak of, but it had very little road car presence outside of being a weird auto union rump thing and doing a few rebadged polos, and of course the whole weight of rally opinion generally seemed to go against it, thinking that it would be too heavy, too bulky, too cumbersome to sort of any weight added would counterbalance any performance benefit. But as you say, the rest is history. There's that Mikola himself put it best in an interview with Motorsport magazine many years later. I'll never forget the first stage I did in that car on the Monte Carlo Rally in 1981. Bernard Dani set off 1 minute ahead of me in his Lancia Stratos. It was a 14-kilometer stage with ice and snow covering the first part. After about 16 kilometers, I passed him on a long straight. I was maybe 100 kilometers per hour faster than him when I overtook. I don't think he knew what hit him. Then people started saying the car would be good only in snow, but they soon had to admit it worked on gravel too.
Speaks for itself, really.
Hindsight's wonderful, but I mean, it's the year that rallying changed. And even if, of course, if that season was beset with rotten reliability and all the other things that a team still finding its way in the sport would be expected to struggle with.
Well, what we have to point out here as well is that Mikola was a real superstar of the age, so the move being looked on in the press at the time was probably with, almost derision. And it's maybe it's a poor comparison, but, when Lewis Hamilton went to Mercedes, no one probably thought a whole much pile of it that it maybe wouldn't lead to much success. It took a little bit longer maybe for that to come right, whereas this pretty much just started working straight away, and it was evident immediately that this was the right call for Mikola, but he was probably being told not to do it, if anything.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you also have the other side of the coin, because Walter Tresser approached Walter Roll at the same time, and Walter refused to take up his offer, I think because he was beholden to the Mercedes contract he had, which of course came to nothing because Mercedes crapped out when they saw the Quattro and withdrew, which is how Michel Mouton got the call. And again, that's probably one of those decisions that at the time must have provoked a fair bit of consternation, but with hindsight it's like, yeah, I mean, superb, right?
Absolutely. And look, it did take 2 seasons for him to get his championship, but it was evident immediately that car was going to work and that 4-wheel drive was going to be the future and going to be the all-conquering must-have. You weren't going to win without it. It was evident, the reliability issues were what really plagued him then, but, he was the guy that ushered in that era, I'd argue, as much as anything else.
Yeah. Absolutely, and if nothing else, because he had to wait for that title, as we got to see him an even more impressive battle against 037s on tarmac. That sort of infamous title duel and battle over the course of several seasons between rear-wheel drive and 4.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it was certainly a great era because you had, of course, that was when the Group B regs had been ushered in, and you had Lancia trying to work a more loose regulation into a more traditional layout in terms of its drive, or where the drive was being sent to. But of course, they worked mid-engine before with the Stratos, but it was a great battle all the same.
I think there was a general thought, thinking in the paddock, that if anyone could make a 2-wheel drive rally car continue to work and beat a 4-wheel drive one, to be Lancia, because I mean, there's a reason they're rallying royalty, and even more so at the time, it was the Ferrari of the sport. Yeah.
And of course, a team that always had something up their sleeve, as well as a previous guest did point out to us.
Well, yes. Yes, moving on from that, I dare say quite neatly, we have further in Group B, Timo Salonen.
Great glasses.
Great glasses, absolutely. A style icon, as Pekka Lappi would surely agree. Yes, and obviously by no means a rank outsider before signing with Peugeot, but equally hardly a household name.
As a stark contrast maybe to Mikola here, because, you know, Mikola, you would have pipped to become world champion at some point. You know, he just lost out to Waldegaard before that switched to Audi. Here we have slightly a different end of the scale.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't know what an equivalent would be in the modern world, you know, because it's hard to judge, you know, how highly rated Salonen was by people in the know at the time. He'd won 3 times though with various Nissans and Datsuns, and did sterling work with the 240 RS throughout 1984. But still, you know, it was quite a quirk of circumstance to put him in the 205.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, he'd obviously impressed Jean Todt enough to be given the shout after Vatanen's unfortunate Argentine off, and he just seemed to click with that 205 immediately, or pretty much immediately. Was it three times, 3 events in, he won in Portugal,
Yeah,
and then you know, just smashed it. You know, four rounds on the bounce mid-season, which really wasn't something that was being done in the championship to that point. And it's, I think, even across the whole Group E era, even the champions of the 80s, there was rarely that many wins in the championship, but to get 4 on the bounce was unheard of, really.
I think that's an important point. You know, we've become accustomed to, or more accustomed to, drivers going on those kind of, you know, winning blitzes in various forms of motorsport, but it was a lot harder to do back then, mainly because of reliability.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it wasn't always down to the talent of the driver. You would be beset by some unforeseen issue, as drivers still are, but it was certainly more prevalent 30, 40, 50 years ago. You couldn't always depend on the car. You were only part of the winning solution, as it were.
Absolutely. And such an unassuming driver, you know, by all accounts, even for Finns, who, as we all know, are fairly quiet and subdued seemingly in terms of that aspect. But yeah, 8 wins over the course of his spell with Peugeot, which is the highest tally of any driver in the Group B era. And yeah, I mean, it's a stat that speaks for itself, really.
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, look, it's proven now, and we knew. I wasn't around, but you know, I think it would have been it would have been common knowledge at the time that the 205 was a winning platform. But I'd imagine, you know, if we were on the outside looking in, would you say, okay, they've got this guy to replace Vatanen? Yeah, that's a great shout. You know, he's definitely got it. Probably wouldn't have said that. You know, you wouldn't be writing him off, but you wouldn't be saying, oh, they've really lucked out here. You know, this guy who's got a speckling of wins and a couple of Datsuns to go out and just go on that, you know, 4-round winning bounce and just, yeah.
That's the thing, isn't it? You know, there's plenty of well, drivers from all over the place, but plenty of Finns from that period and before who were, you know, lightning quick on a round or on a given surface or in a particular car, but struggle to sort of make that, to eke that form over a wider spread of results and surfaces. But Timo Salonen, let's face it, you know, from the off, quick in most things, quick everywhere, give or take, and you know, the title speaks for itself, really.
And you know, and he had that world championship locked in pretty quickly. Then, as a result, it was you know, it was quite early on. It was never in doubt that he was going to be world champion at the end of the year.
It must have been quite a contrast, even if you probably would never admit to it. But you know, pooling around in that 240 RS, which is, I mean, the most, I think probably the most Group 4-ish of the actual Group B rally cars in terms of concept. You know, naturally aspirated rear-wheel drive, resolutely so, versus, you know, by most people's reckoning, the peak Group B car. You know, we could argue about S4s and things, but in terms of the concept and in terms of, you know, public profile, it's 205 T16, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, big time. You know, yeah. What more can we say, really? You know, and the 240 RS, I've great place in my heart for it. I mean, it looks like it's a Lego car in terms of its shape, but it's damn cool. But it was never going to win a world championship.
Oh, absolutely.
And Timo Salonen, I suppose, bit of trivia to drop in, his co-driver from that year, the only co-driver to win a world championship with 2 separate drivers.
Very neat.
Good pub quiz fact there, if one was ever doing a rallying based pub quiz. So coming out of the Group B era, to someone who was driving then, but we're going to cover a different part of his career. Juha Kankkunen, someone who would have driven across many different eras of rallying over the course of his long and distinguished career. But here we're going to talk about his move from Lancia to Toyota in 1988.
Yes. Obviously, Kankkunen was the first world champion of the Group A era in '87. And also, I believe became the first driver to defend a title in WRC history back then as well. But I think it became clear that he became very quickly fed up with the with Lancia's hyper partisan way of going about rallying, which is hardly a surprise given that they've been doing it forever and ever, and people like Bjorn Waldegard were getting sick of it 10 years previously. But it's a strong argument for him being de facto team leader, and I can kind of see why he got fed up. And in the end, it proved too much. That, coupled with the lure of what Toyota and TTE were doing with the Group A Celica, proved too much, and he opted to decamp to Toyota for 1988.
Yes, of course, somewhere he had started his career with Toyota as well, of course, didn't he? So,
yes.
Somewhat familiar grounds, perhaps. But did have his hand forced somewhat. If you look at any videos of Kankkunen or read about his nature and his manner, you don't really see it as someone that would necessarily gel with that Lancia approach to doing things, do you?
No. I mean, there's a reason we all talk about Marco Allen as the Tim Finn, because he's such an anomaly for that nation's drivers, isn't he? Kankkunen has a lot more to the standard Finnish fare that we expect.
Stoic.
Stoic indeed, yeah. Fond of Pirellis. And then, of course, he got to Toyota. Must have been the fact that the GT4 was such a high-profile program at the time. Was well known that Japanese teams like Toyota favoured production Group A rallying, so it was very much in the team's wheelhouse. And the car had a very high-profile development, with the X-Track transmission link as well with Mike Endine. It must have seemed like a very good program for him to hitch his wagon to.
Yeah, and a great team principal in Ove Anderson. I don't think there's really anyone who didn't like working with him that I've ever seen or heard about. Really good guy, got the best out of his people across the board. So that must, runs a tight ship. Coming from Lancia's somewhat haphazard way of doing things, this must really seem like right in Kankkunen's wheelhouse, as it were. The Integrale, okay, it hangs around another while after this, but the GT4, newer, more modern, more technologically advanced, perhaps. Does the Integrale seem like it doesn't have a whole pile of life left in it at this point?
Yeah, I mean, everyone. Sorry, go on, mate.
No, maybe so. That's pretty much it. Yeah,
I think everyone, perhaps except even Lancia, were surprised by how much development potential that car had. I mean, there must have been so many times prior to spoiler alert, 1993, that various team principals and drivers had thought, there's no way that they can get more power, more suspension travel out of this, boxy hatchback that was come that point was 10 years old, if not more.
Yeah.
And yet they did. And the Celica, for all its tech and polish, was fairly torrid for 88 and 89. Lots and lots of retirements, lot of overheating, the sort of infamous cooling blanks that TTE stipulated needs to be removed, and then supposedly Toyota engineers, when it got back to Japan, decided looked horrible and decided to blank off and then homologate in place, which completely stymied the team to do much with them afterwards. And that kind of set the record for the rest of those two seasons, really.
Yeah, I suppose, look, where the GT4 fell down was that it was this new thing with a newish team, and where Lancia was still succeeding was that they knew what they were doing and they knew how they got that platform to work. Whereas of course TTE would come good, but like anything that's new, there is going to be issues. But the stats from that first season make for fairly grim reading. A guy off the back of 2 world championships to 37th overall in the final championship standings at the end of 1988. It's a big fall.
And how? I mean, yeah. And another thing that the points, the best points haul that he got that year, the only one, 8 points, well, the Safari, which was the only round that Toyota opted to send the Supra Turbo, which of course was a very cool car, but completely ill-suited to all the European sprint style events, very much an African specialist in the same manner of the Celica twin cam turbo of the Group B era. And yeah, so hardly the kind of baptism you'd want for a new Group A rally car.
Yeah, and they didn't improve too much for next year, although they did improve.
Could only improve.
Yes, well, it's hard to really fall much lower, is it? And they get a win in Rally Australia, but still a lot of reliability issues across the whole season, wasn't there?
Yeah, Australia back then, late in the season, I'm pretty sure Kankkunen had already decided he was out the door for 1990. And of course, he went off back to Lancia for 1990, which hardly a bad move because Kankkunen didn't make too many, but that did serve to promote Carlos Sainz to the 1990 season and effectively team leader at TTE. And again, history speaks, and he made very good use of that to win his first title.
Yes, which then leads us very neatly to the doors going in the opposite direction, with Sainz going from Toyota to Lancia in 1993. So if we're talking about a car that must surely be at the end of its development cycle in 88, 89, this move still puzzles to this day. At this point as well, we have to note that it isn't a works outfit really anymore. This is now the Jolly Club team running the car. It's pretty much the same guys, but it's not quite a works effort. We're on the Evo 2 Integrale at this point, correct?
Yeah.
Deltona. Yeah, and yeah, off the back of his win with TTE in this, new Japanese techie, new way of doing things, maybe, to go back and drive a car that, surely seemed like there wasn't much left in it. And at this point as well, we already have Subaru and Rally Art, ProDrive Subaru and Rally Art starting to come over the horizon, that the dawning of the Japanese dominance of the World Rally Championship and a different style of production rallying is now going to be fairly evident. To move to Lancia seems like an unusual choice.
Yeah, I mean, as ever, hindsight's a wonderful thing. We've all got a master's in hindsight, but yeah, I guess someone was always going to be left holding the can at Lancia by. It must have almost been like musical chairs, aware that at some point this car is going to stop being competitive. But it hadn't shown any signs, particularly of doing that the preceding 3 years. And yeah, I mean, it's a move that everyone, I believe, wanted Carlos to do, ever since he was cutting his teeth in Sierras and things in the late 80s. And I'd bet their house that if he'd somehow managed to wangle his way into there 2 years previously, it would be the world-beating combo that everyone expected. But just 1 year too late. And by that point, the Integrale had been caught and maybe not felled, because he got, a couple of podiums and a fantastic second place in the Acropolis, but it was not the tour de force that we all expected.
What I always think about with this one as well is that, he's a young driver, clearly full of talent. He's already got a couple of world championships. But what does he see beyond 1993? Like, does he just go, I'm going to do a one and done setup here at Lancia? What sort of future was there? I mean, with the best will in the world, I'm sure he knows there's going to be options open for him, but there isn't always. But, does he see a continuation of that program? Is there a new something coming? Yeah. What are they going to do beyond that? If it all works out and everyone's happy, and what do you do after that? What's on the horizon for rallying a Lancia?
I think partly I've heard that he got very. I mean, obviously he won the '92 title with the Toyota, but it was an incredibly evil handling car at times, the ST185, and a classic case of a driver winning a title, winning despite the car's foibles rather than because of them. So maybe it was a case of wanting to get some space away from it, and maybe if you were being charitable, you'd say that he wanted to see how the car developed before going back there, or perhaps he didn't think it was a win that he'd managed to secure against the odds and he couldn't do again.
Yeah, I mean, look, they all struggled with that car, didn't they? So the chance to move to Lancia, maybe just to wipe the slate clean and see what comes next.
Yeah, and yet it's statistically the most successful sleeker rally car of them all. It obviously came good. It became Swiss watch reliable, even if it was always a bit heavy and a bit ponderous, I've heard. But yeah, by that point, TTE had got their eye in and knew what they were doing. And of course, it was when you could really could throw money at a problem in terms of the infrastructure supporting a team in a car, helicopters, remote servicing, the whole shebang.
Yeah, I suppose it's as much memorable for it being the death knell of the Integrale's dominance, just maybe with a driver that probably didn't deserve to be part of that death knell.
Yeah, and to give it its due, it was hardly, it didn't fall from grace dramatically, did it? Perhaps if it had won one rally, then it would be even sweeter. But for a car that was launched as a road car 11 years previously, it's still quite something for it to be able to get second in the WRC round.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, it's not. Maybe we're being very harsh on the Integrale here, and there's going to be Italians clamoring for our blood. It wasn't like it was trounced, but it still seemed to be doing reasonably well in spite of its age. It's just it has to be underlined, really, doesn't it?
And from that, we go to Richard Burns opting to depart Mitsubishi to Subaru for the '99 season, which is one of those that perhaps might not jump out as an interesting move, in as much as Burns was by no means a failure at Mitsubishi. In fact, he's one of the few drivers able to master the unique driving style required to get the most from the Evo 4 and 5. They've both been developed, all those have been developed with Tommy in mind and his very unique driving style. But all the same, it's hard to deny that it was a move that worked out very well. Obviously, it worked out very, very well 2 years later. But I don't think that Mitsubishi would have permitted Burns to ever beat Tommy in terms of team orders. I mean, perhaps if he'd started out by trouncing Mäkinen from the very beginning in 98, let's say, and just gave him nowhere to go. But that probably was never going to happen, given Tommy was in a team built around him and the peak of his form.
Yeah, and look, I mean, that's what a consummate champion does really well, is they create that place for themselves. And that's why they're able to succeed repeatedly year on year when those things do happen. So you're dead right. Like it was really never going to, it was just not going to work for Burns, despite his obvious talent that we all know. It just wasn't going to be the place for him to really showcase it. He was going to be, at best, a good second at Mitsubishi. So yeah, Banbury came calling. He had done some driving for Subaru in Subarus before, so he was reasonably familiar with the setup and organization as they were with him. And off he went.
Yeah, and I mean, Burns himself waxed lyrical about how much he liked that '99 car, and even particular WRC 2000 of the year following. He goes into great detail in the McLaren Rally book or the Rally Cars book, about how much he loves that car and how much it put the Evo 5 into perspective. Obviously, by no means a bad car at all, but absolutely a step up in terms of what could be thought of as what was possible from a world rally car at the time.
Yeah, and it allowed the spotlight to really shine on Burns for the first time properly. I mean, not to say that, he was an unknown, but to really, really show what this guy can do when he's given the opportunity to do so, with a good outfit, a winning outfit behind him. And still, with teammates that weren't exactly slouches either. So, he still had a fight in his hands in terms of teammates. He wasn't the quote unquote lead driver by any means.
But he
at that
became
time.
that, didn't he? Eventually,
Exactly,
through and it gives us all the stories. I mean, Kankkunen was no pushover back then, as that infamous "where there's a fin, there's a shark" quote from Robert Reid after what was it? It wasn't Rally Finland in '99. The one that he got pipped to the post on. I think it was Argentina. Should know that.
Mm-hmm.
But
I'll have to check. I won't pretend to know that one.
Kankkunen disobeyed team orders to take that his last ever win, I believe.
Yeah, and then and Kankkunen was, right on him all the way through this time. He got this a great second place in Finland, which was up against Kankkunen all the way, who did take the victory there, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, that I think personally that's my favorite Burns performance, because I remember, I'm old enough to remember watching that, on Eurosport at the time, and just being entranced that it could be possible that someone so far away from Scandinavian norm could be doing so well on the Thousand Lakes, and against such talented opposition. Fell slightly short at the end, but then that's no shame given the quality he was against.
I mean, this is still an era where it was expected that the non-Scandinavian would always struggle at the Thousand Lakes, but it was starting to change. But he was up against a local man, and he put it right up to them.
Yeah, and also proved that it's maybe Burns isn't one of these drivers that most people call to mind, a name that most people call to mind instantly when someone mentions outright speed. But those performances in '99 and 2000 in those early WRC impretas kind of give lie to that. He was phenomenally quick, as quick as anyone when he had the right tools.
Yeah, and I suppose we have to ask, maybe, would he have still become how we remember him now if he'd stayed at Rally Art? Tommy, I'd probably not, I'd argue, because the car wouldn't have been capable for it continuing, as we know that they prolonged the life of the Group A car just too long. And then the early WRC efforts were not good, frankly.
That's an early episode of Rally DNA to hear all about that.
Yeah. But like I said earlier, a champion will now make a place his own and build a setup around him that will allow him to win consistently. And he was rewarded with a world championship with Subaru a couple of years later.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a counterfactual, isn't there? Maybe there's an alternate history where Burns manages to win quite a few rallies in 98 and 99 with the Evo 5 and then 6, and then manages to play an outsized role in convincing Rally Art to sort of double down on a Lancer WRC sooner and earlier and more emphatically, and then he wins in 2001 all the same, but they're in the red car. So who knows?
Indeed. An alternate reality, perhaps. And from there, then, I suppose at a similar time, we have a gentleman by the name of Marcus Gronholm, who is now moving to Peugeot in 1999. Peugeot, you say Peugeot.
I thought you might pick that up. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, you all know what I'm talking about. So he's come from a slightly different scenario here, because he's not quite, he's in and out of works teams occasionally. He'll turn up, he'll be called upon for certain events with works outfits, but generally speaking, he's been in and out of a few cars the previous few years, hasn't he? Yes,
and he also took it up relatively late. I think he was, well into his 30s by this point, I think, he did, great work in ST205 GT4s and, early Corollas and the Phase 1 Cordoba WRC. But, with the best will in the world, didn't set the world alight. And I still don't think many people would have put, a mental bet on him being a world champion a year after signing with Peugeot.
It certainly wasn't one of the evidence of one of these meteoric rises to power, fame, and championship titles. Certainly, not to do Marcus any disservice here, and driving different cars throughout every couple of seasons before that, was there an escort Cosworth along the way there as well? But certainly, to arrive in the fashion he did, and obviously, I don't know exactly the circumstances that led to that contract, but he obviously showed enough to be signed for that 206. And as we know, that car was very, very good.
That's it. Yeah. I mean, and he was quick in the 206 in 99 and had mounted a sort of an outside attack for winning Rally Finland that year before he went overtime at a service. But, even then, with the best one in the world, plenty of Finns are quick at home. In fact, you could argue that it's, you've got to be very quick at home to even be a Finnish rally driver. So I still think most people would have perhaps thought twice before betting on him being such an all-accomplished, or turning into the all-accomplished all-rounder that he became very swiftly after that.
Well, I suppose it's probably the nature of the outfit that hired him as well. There probably wasn't going to be a seat for this guy at the more established runners that have been going throughout the previous decade. There probably wasn't going to be a seat for him at Rally Art, Pro Drive, or Ford. But the team itself was somewhat of an outsider, perhaps you could argue, and not an inexperienced team, but you know what I mean.
Oh yeah, there was I think there was a solid foundation of PSA tech who were kept in the fold from the Group B era, because obviously Peugeot spent the 90s being motorsport as hell. They went from Group B to endurance, and then that terrible dalliance in F1, and then back to rallying again. So I'm sure there was a core group of engineers and experience, underneath Corrado Provera, but not the powerhouse that we now know it to be.
Yeah, and then he went on to make his world title look rather easy.
Yeah. As a kid, that certainly seemed to come a bit out of the blue, that title. Certainly as a staunch McRae and Burns fan, I was, far more partisan back then when I was younger, and it seemed, almost unheard of that he should be able to do this. But, easily one of the drivers of his generation.
A car and driver coming right at exactly the same time.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? That car was the template for what a world rally car could be. As much as the early late 90s Imprezzas were quick and impressive, it was tiny wheelbase with tiny overhangs, and as much as you could do within those confines, really, which Peugeot made work, and led the way for the best part of half a decade.
Yeah, I mean, look, it was the car to beat really for so long, and it spawned copycats almost as well. So you could argue the legalities of the car itself, but maybe that's a subject for another day.
Are you referencing the extended bumpers and the need to get them homologating with that horrible 206 GT?
Correct. I did actually see one parked at the side of the road the other day going green in the middle of nowhere in Limerick somewhere, under a bush. It's atrocious, bumpers protruding onto the road as a hazard to passing cyclists.
Got to be the cheapest way into homologation special ownership still going.
Cheap, but perhaps maybe still not worth it, as you have to be seen in one. But yeah, I'm sure there's a home for it somewhere. Someone
I will go on record.
Where is it?
I will go on record as saying the 206 looked best in the 99 colours, personally. I think I love that white and blue. Maybe because that's V Rally 2 imprinted in my memory. But for me, that's it.
Yes, I don't know. I might debate it. It's good, but yeah, I don't know. I like the silver one.
It's pretty good. Another thing that I hadn't thought about, I suppose it's also worth pointing that there was quite a long history of Finnish drivers doing very well in Peugeots. I mean, Salonen, it's just a short few years previously.
Yeah, fair point, well made. From there, we're going to go to a driver we've referenced in a previous one, Mr. Tommy Mäkinen. So this move is certainly falls into the camp of maybe just fizzled and not quite right. But I think I find this really interesting in terms of that it must be evidence of maybe not quite the passing of a torch, but maybe the passing of the torch for a whole generation of rally drivers, not quite
Changing
from
of the
one to the
guard.
other. Yes, more appropriate perhaps. When Tommy went to Subaru, and I still think anytime I see a picture of Tommy in blue, it does seem like something from an alternate universe. There's something inherently wrong about Tommy Mackinnon wearing blue overalls at Subaru on them, in my mind anyway.
Especially if they have 555 from that year instead of the rally art. It's like he's got the wrong cigarette sponsorship as well.
Yeah, he's done it all wrong. So yeah, I mean, this very obviously didn't work out, but maybe it's just the fashion in which it didn't is really the why it's so interesting to discuss, and obviously this changing of the guard type scenario here. You know, I don't think it's really worth too much talking about his time at Rally Art. We all know how it went. Yeah, 4 world titles. But how did this come about? I suppose, look, Rally Art were quite late to the World Rally Car regulations, as we've discussed previously. You know, persisting with the Group A car, you know, again, with the benefit of hindsight, clearly the wrong decision, although I think you'd probably have to say at the time it seemed like an odd one too, but it didn't actually hurt them too much. It wasn't as disastrous as one might expect early on, because they did all right with that Group A car when the WRC cars were coming through then, didn't they?
Well, yes, but that was partly positive because they made a sort of Faustian bargain, didn't they, to keep developing the old Group A car, because Tommy was doing so well and the 2001 title was still theoretically up for grabs. But they'd made that deal with the FIA previously, some years previously. They said they had to have a World Rally Car homologated by Finland 2001. So that was an immovable date, and as we've discussed, you know, it must have been a case of, right, all the eggs in the Group A basket, Tommy can probably win it, who knows. And if it had come off, then hey, we wouldn't be looking back with it perhaps with as much
yeah, and it's probably, you know, it wasn't that disastrous at the time. It's probably more disastrous in what followed it, really, in that they were just too far behind, really, in the WRC regs, as the other teams were getting to grips with it, and the teething problems and the new way of doing things had been more or less worked out.
Yeah, I think we all expected, anyone watching the time thought it, you know, completely inconceivable that Mitsubishi wouldn't be back winning again in a sustained fashion within a few years.
Yeah, it still hurts, to be honest, a little bit. But yeah, so in 2001, they did indeed homologate the Step 1 WRC car, and Tommy and his teammate Freddie Likes struggled. There's not really any other way of putting it, is there?
I mean, Likes was used to that.
Yeah. Well, now you're offending Freddie. But yeah, that culminated in a crash. His co-driver's back was broken, which ended his career. You know, Tommy was obviously very frustrated at this point with the car, visibly so, and seeking pastures new. And he didn't have anything left to prove, really, did he? You know, certainly behind the wheel of a Mitsubishi anyway. And he made the switch to Banbury for 2002, replacing Richard Burns.
Which, of course, was a fairly contentious swap in its own right anyway, that one.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things from the outside looking in, especially at the time. You thought, well, he's just going to slot right in and carry on where he left off. You know, it's a Finn in a Japanese saloony thing with, you know, how could it not?
Yeah, and the car he was going to had just won the World Championship as well. So, you know, winning car. When he made his debut, it was still the car from the previous season as well. It was still the S7. And he won on his first outing in it as well. Now, by not on the road, admittedly, but, you know, you still have to be there. Loeb was disqualified at the end of Monte Carlo, and Mackinnon inherited the win, but he still had to be there to inherit it. Second in Monte is still a good result, and inheriting first is even better.
I'm pretty sure that was 2 minutes ago. I refuse to believe it's 2 decades. That's awful.
Christ, yeah, it is that long ago, isn't it? Yeah. And from there, it got a little bit rockier, didn't it?
Yes. You know, I mean, it quite quickly became apparent that he struggled to gel with the car, and also that there was a new generation, perhaps not so much waiting in the wings anymore, but elbowing its way to the fore.
Yeah, I mean, look, the results for that season don't make for happy reading for Tommy, do they? You know, retired on 6 events and disqualified on another. He did get 2 more podiums along the way, but really glimmers of light in an otherwise dark period.
Especially for a guy who majored on consistency, throughout the early portion of his career.
Well, exactly, like this guy's whole thing, isn't it?
I remember reading some Rally XS rundown of the top 10 drivers of that season at the time, and I think they put Tommy in last, and the fella's sign off was, "I can't wait till they hoik him out of that car at the end of the season." In fact, this was the end of the following year, rather, because he's tarnishing his reputation, which is perhaps a little unfair, but he certainly didn't do his reputation any favors.
No, I mean, look, he looked decidedly grumpy in those blue overalls. Maybe just blue just wasn't for him.
Not his color.
But yeah, like, to bring us back to a point I've made earlier on, I think this then does really usher in a new generation of drivers, really, because Tommy wasn't the only guy from his generation to struggle with these cars in the active 2-liter WRC era, were they?
No. Yeah, but we don't even bother listening. We don't even bother to list the guys like Colin and who also struggled with the Zara the following year. Yeah, definitely a sort of sea change in what was required to get the most from one of these modern cars. And I suppose there's perhaps a case of teaching an old dog new tricks. Some guys proved able to adapt to it. Gronholm perhaps being the best example, but some of these guys who'd cut their teeth throwing Group A, or perhaps even if we go far enough back, Group B stuff around, really did seem to struggle to gel with the smoother flowing, less is more style needed by the active cars.
Yeah, and I mean, look, this was really evidenced in 2003. So we've moved to the S9 now. The S7 and S8, they're things of the past. Maybe they were just bad cars that Tommy wasn't able to work with. But in 2003, the other car was driven to the title by his teammate Petter Solberg, whereas Tommy just had a mediocre season, really not befitting a man of his talents. And then he hung up his helmet after finishing third on Rally GB at the end of the year, admittedly, but it really just finished off his time in the rally car, didn't it?
Vividly, yeah, absolutely. I remember vividly watching that at the time. I was there at the stage with my dad, and I'm pretty sure it was a battle for third between Colin and Tommy, which Tommy ultimately emerged victorious on. Sticks in my mind. Yeah, definitely felt like a sort of changing of the guard and the passing of a torch at the time, and even more so now with yet again the benefit of time, hindsight, and distance.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't the only one, was he? But I think it was just maybe just more obvious in Tommy's case, perhaps, along with Petter.
Well, also because he was the winningest driver in WRC history at the time. I can't have been alone in thinking it was fairly inconceivable that anyone would top 4 on the bounce. Didn't take long to be disabused of that notion, of course, but at the time, that seemed fairly unimpeachable.
Yeah, and look, we'll talk about someone in a minute, who also came off the back of multiple world championships into a new regulation era and a new team and new car, and did make it work. So it can be done. But maybe in this time, not the same kind of transition, was it?
No, not at all. Of course, it's not always quite such a clear-cut thing, because there are several instances of very successful championship-winning drivers leaving a team and then bringing their success with them and carrying on right where they left off. And perhaps one of the best, most recent examples of this is Sébastien Ogier's move from Volkswagen Motorsport to M Sport Ford in 2017.
Yeah, and I suppose not so much a move in terms of he was evicted and had to find a new house.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that seems like I struggle to believe that's so far ago, 5-6 years ago now as well. It seems so fresh. All the hoo-ha and the discussion as to where he was going to end up, and I remember him covertly testing various cars. I think he tested the Yaris at the time. Obviously, certainly the Fiesta. I'm pretty sure the only one he didn't test in the winter off season that year was the C3.
Which I think maybe is kind of unusual, given, okay, he did end up at Citroën later on, but you would have thought maybe that this is Citroën rubbing their hands and saying, right, let's get Ogier on board, French driver, French team.
He should have stuck with that, whatever told him not to go there originally.
Yeah, so as you say, I mean, look, they're all going to be clamoring for this guy, surely, again, multiple world championships on the bounce, just no real challenge to him, really, was there? there was a Eurosport headline of OGA impresses M Sport in Fiesta test, which seems like the most ridiculous thing to say. I mean, of course he's going to impress M Sport. It's Sebastian Ogier.
I mean, I was lucky enough to do a phone interview with Malcolm Wilson in midway through 2018, I think, and talked to him about that test. And he said, you know, did you know straight away how much of an asset he was going to be? And he said, absolutely yes. And as you might expect when it comes to a driver like Ogier, you know, he was incredibly impressed by how professional and how set up and tech ready he was from the very beginning, you know, offering improvements and suggestions for setup tweaks that paid dividends there and then. The kind of thing that, you know, if you need to be a hyper successful world rally driver in the modern era, you kind of need as part of your toolkit, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think, look, the reason we've selected this to go on the list really is as a counterpoint, obviously, to Tommy's, you know, not so successful transition to Subaru, but also that this move to M Sport probably wasn't the most obvious one, was it? You know, given that he's coming from this seeming Volkswagen juggernaut, well-oiled, you know, well-clicking machine. Not to say that M Sport isn't, but you know, they didn't have the same level of backing or budget or manufacturer support. So it may not have seemed like the most natural home for a guy coming from VW Motorsport, in my eyes, and it didn't to me at the time. I was very happy to see him go there.
No, but there's a reason that it caused so many big headlines when it was announced, right? I mean, there's a reason. There's that video of Malcolm announcing to the M Sport, you know, crew and team back in Cumbria that they'd got him, and everyone going wild into fits of rapture because, you know, partly they knew what that meant, but also it was always a bit of an out there ask, wasn't it? And I'm sure it took a lot of backroom negotiating and number crunching for it to happen.
Well, I suppose obviously in the first year, the benefit was that his wages were still being paid by Volkswagen, wasn't it? So, which, you know, a huge benefit, because I was assuming as well that his wage is quite substantial, that you can then dump that into the cars development.
Which, of course, I mean, you know, M Sport have a long history, a proud history of starting new developmental regs very strongly. And this most recent set is, well, the ones recently replaced, it's got to be the best example, right? I mean, the 2017, 2018 Fiesta, you know, its advantage was steadily eroded, but for that first season, pretty much the car to have, and the following one in Ogier's hands.
Yeah, well, I'd maybe argue a little bit different. I think, you know, Ogier is probably the force multiplier here. That the Yaris is probably arguably the stronger car of the bunch at this time, but he is just this force multiplier. And then, you know, with the benefit of his experience and his professionalism and his developmental knowledge, you know, we all know the stories with there was different dampers being thrown in for him and all these setup adjustments, and that's what makes a champion, make a different outfit work in a real way. In a car that, not that it shouldn't have been winning, but it may not have been the obvious winner alongside its contemporaries.
Classic greater than the sum of its component parts in terms of car and driver thing. And he also became, I believe, the first Ford rally driver to defend a title in a Ford when he did the double in 2018.
Which does seem bizarre when you take Ford's history in the sport into account.
Doesn't it? It does.
They're probably the one constant in rallying, really. Pretty much, aren't they? They would be.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, there's been a few close calls, and of course, you know, the lack of presence in the early mid 80s after the Mark II and the aborted Mark III RS 1700T, of course. But yeah, absolutely, the closer we've got to a sort of a perennial constant in rallying.
And then, of course, when he does leave Ford to go to Citroen, we didn't have the first time in years that a Sebastian didn't win the World Championship.
Yes.
In what was, you know, it probably wasn't as ill-informed a decision as one would think. I mean, you know, the obvious driving of a Berlingo full of cash up to his house, you know, but a chance to win a championship in a French team, in a French car, before presumably heading off into the sunset.
Fairy tale ending.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like that was the plan at the time. I don't know about you.
Yeah, and let's face it, it wouldn't have been at all naive or indeed arrogant of him to correctly think, if anyone can make this car work, it has to be me. Because I mean, look at his CV, look at his back record, and everything else. The commitment to make it work was never in doubt, at least early on. But then, of course, the C3 WRC was fundamentally a bit of a compromised car, and I'm not going to open the can of worms as to who we should blame for that, or but certainly it seemed a car that was hard to improve upon to any great deal.
Yeah, I don't think any amount of seat time and testing with Ogier would have turned it into a winning car without a huge overhaul of the platform itself.
I mean, of course, he did win in it, of course, didn't he? He won more than anyone else in it in terms of actual victories. But yeah, those were interspaced by fairly big retirements.
Yeah, I mean, look, it wasn't a car that was ever going to give him another world championship. There just was no way it was going to work, was it?
No. Yeah.
But he certainly made that time at M Sport work, and I think it's a great example of the champion making the right decision, ensuring the tools for him to continue winning were at his disposal. He might have been able to wield his power maybe a bit more readily at M Sport than going to one of the big manufacturers that were backing the teams fully.
Yes.
Who had their own kind of fingers in the pie and ideas for drivers and stuff.
I mean, it's a proper feel-good story, and I think it's one of these things. It's one of the greatest human stories of the modern era in the WRC, I think personally, and I think it's also one of these sort of anecdotes and stories that will only become more and more impressive with the passage of time.
Yeah, and it's always great to see M Sport win because they're just that. There's always an element of underdog to the M Sport story, and everyone loves that, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. It's like modern era Williams doing well. It's hard to begrudge them, especially where in this case, unlike Williams, they are winning on merit, consistently winning and winning titles. Let's not denigrate them by saying it was luck or overachieving all the way. It was like, no, it was a damn good car with a damn good team with an incredible driver.
You make your own luck.
Spot on.
And sticking with the 2017 WRC era, it leads us neatly to one that's more of a strange scenario, perhaps, and definitely one that falls into the category of, times that rallying doesn't really give you a whole pile of options for different seats, different drives because of the nature of the sport and the small amount of cars, teams, and contracts available. With Esa-Pekka Lappi going from Toyota to Citroen.
Absolutely right. I mean, Lappi when he exploded into that Toyota gig in 2017, I think certainly I remember professing him a world champion in waiting, and it was only a matter of time before he was, knocking on the door of Ogier and Co. But I mean that Finnish win 4 events. I think it's the 4th Yaris start he did.
Yeah.
You can never take that away from him. That was a comprehensive blitzing performance.
Yeah, in a car that is streets ahead of what he was driving the year before, because there's no other way of putting it. There's a huge gulf between R5 cars and World Rally cars of that period. So to get so comfortable in an event like that and take home your maiden WRC victory is so impressive and remains so. But I mean, you've got to look at his lead up to this point in Toyota. That meteoric rise is certainly evident in this case. European champion 2014, dominated WRC in 2016. 9th place on his maiden Monte Carlo in an R5 car, and the same year he was 7th overall in Rally Deutschland in an R5 car. So you can't take any of that away from a guy. That's a guy that has the chops.
You can see why they signed him up.
Absolutely, although Mäkinen didn't want to sign him really, because he tried to get Meek and he couldn't because he'd been tied down to a long-term contract with Citroen and then opted for Lappi.
Yeah, it's easy to forget how much pulling power Meek had back then. Yeah, incredible. Not that he's not a talented driver in his own right.
Oh yeah, don't get me wrong. I'm as much a Meek fan as the next person, but it seems to me that at the time it would be an unusual choice to opt for a guy that's over, someone that's, coming up winning in the junior categories, clearly has a bright future, to a guy that's maybe coming to the end of his career. He's that bit older, still got the talent to win rallies, but for a new team in a new regulation era, and a Finn as well, to
Yeah.
sit in a team that's based in Finland, that would have seemed to me like a more logical option than trying to sign Meek from Citroen.
Yeah, you'd think it would be something of a no-brainer, wouldn't you? I'm not sure as to the thinking of that.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I forgot that was the case as well. I just, it's a few years ago now. I was like, yeah, Lappy was signed up. Yeah, that's obvious enough given his history. But then 2018 comes around. Meek loses a seat at Citroen after a series of accidents in, we've discussed this just a moment ago, a car that is inherently flawed. And then all of a sudden, Meek's going to Toyota. So Tommy Mäkinen has gotten the guy he's wanted all along, it seems. But that does leave Mr. Lappy out of a seat.
Yeah, it was an odd state of affairs, wasn't it? And you can see why when Citroen came a calling, even though the C3's weaknesses would have been apparent to him, the idea of a Pucker Works contract with the winningest rally team in the modern era, it doesn't take much of a leap of thought to see why Lappy made the call on paper.
Yeah, and again, he's in the position now that there isn't much room at the table. There's limited space. You're going to take what you can get, aren't you? So you can't
That's the thing.
Try and criticize his decision by any means. He's going to stay at the top of his sport in a team that has a great history, and presumably he says, well, okay, they could come good, but I'd imagine he would have stayed happily at Toyota in a car that was evidently the pick of the bunch. They're all very close, admittedly, bar the Citroen, but this is a good car. Okay, he's probably not going to beat Tanak in that car, perhaps, but he's doing okay, isn't he? It's not like he's had a disastrous 2018, although oddly, he did score more podiums in the C3 in 2019 than he did in the Yaris in 2018, in which he came third twice in the Yaris in 2018, and he came second 3 times in 2019 in the Citroen, which is unusual.
It's another good answer and question for the most esoteric rally pub quiz ever. That. And then, of course, there's also the unknown of Lappy's seemingly somewhat fractious relationship with Toyota higher-ups at the time. Hard to know how much of it's true and how much where to apportion blame. But, I think we've all heard at the time about sort of reports of things being quite fractious with him and Tommy.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe that is now being proved to be true, given that Lappy is now back at Toyota, partially at least, with Jari Matti at the helm.
Yes, and yeah, absolutely, yeah.
But I mean, his time at Citroen wasn't all bad, because he did get to meet you, didn't he? And drive you around at a Berlingo.
He did. I'm not sure how far up Lappy's own career highlights that rank. Certainly much higher in mine than his, I dare say.
Was it the same Berlingo they used to deliver all that money to Sebastian Ogier's house?
I found a few euros kicking around the bank. I wish you told me about the fly-off hydro handbrake when I was having a quick pootle around the rally stage on it, though. He hid that until he jumped in the driving seat.
So there was a fly-off handbrake in a Berlingo.
It was a hydro, yeah. It was tasty, yeah. Hidden behind the part of the plastic dash cover, which made the whole thing a lot more entertaining when he was driving, of course.
I wonder, could I get one fitted to my Berlingo?
Yeah. And then the rest, again, as they say, is history. It's a bit of a hackneyed thing to say, but Citroen's withdrawal at the end of 2019 kind of left Lappy up the creek for a while.
Yeah, and I mean, look, he's, again, we've already given evidence of the man, what the man can do behind the wheel of a rally car, and he's doing all right in that Toyota in the few events he's gone out on. He did okay in the Ford as well. He did, of course, the 2020 season isn't worth remembering for many reasons. But he had a few outings in it, wasn't particularly shameful or anything like that, and he's getting on okay with that Yaris.
But he got a 4th in Finland last year in a semi-privateer Yaris WRC, didn't he? Which,
Yep.
you know, I mean, we all know that drivers don't lose their speed that quickly, but it must have been a proper confidence boost to have a strong finish like that for his own sort of mental fortitude.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, I imagine after the couple of years he's had, those are the kind of things that you need as a driver to rediscover some form, isn't it? It's always the one people are clamoring about. You just need to get that result to get you back going again. And of course, he came third in Sweden this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's quite interesting about this point, more so than the others, is that it's very much unfolding as we speak. You know, there's nothing to say that I mean, unlikelier things have happened than Lappi putting strong performances together in the remaining rounds he has and getting further success in the years to come. You know, we all know motorsport's a wild thing. Who knows?
Well, you'd imagine that perhaps with Ogier's partial program going on, and Lappi seems to be picking up other events, that when Ogier finally does ride off into the sunset, that there might be more seat time available for Lappi. And I'd like to see it. To be honest, he seems like a good bloke and all that, and I'd like to see more of what he can do behind the wheel of a rally car.
So he's a nice guy.
Well, you have to say that, he's your mate. And that neatly brings us to an end. I hope we didn't waffle too much with this one. It's something new for us to try. Bit of fun doing it.
Please do let us know what you thought. Don't worry, it won't be replacing the regular format, but we wanted to give it a go, whether to make sort of the back and forth conversational stuff work, and hopefully, as Killian said, you found it entertaining.
Yeah, we may certainly do more episodes of this type. It's nice to try something new, and it's a bit of fun doing the research and whatnot for it as well. So yeah, I hope you've all enjoyed it. And that brings us to an end of season 1 of Rally DNA. And still can't believe we've gotten a season, never mind 10 episodes and some part 1s and 2s as well along the way. It's been great. I didn't think that this would ever come this far.
Credit to you, man. Your idea, your baby to start with. It's an incredible thing, and it's wonderful to be part of.
Thank you, and thanks for being part of it too. I mean, look, it takes a bit of the pressure off. I think it would be very intimidating to try this on your own anyway. So yeah. So we're going to take a break for a few weeks. We'll still be interviewing some new guests for season 2 along the way, and we will rejoin you guys in 4 weeks' time for a new episode for season 2. Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening, everyone.